A mysterious homeless woman seeks refuge in a lonely millionaire's mansion. But when he notices a tattoo on her wrist, just like his missing daughter, he begins a search that could change everything. What if the echo of the past holds a truth more painful than they imagine? The night fell heavily on the city. The rain, relentless, beat the pavement like an unbalanced drum. Arthur Velasquez looked out the windows of his mansion. The silhouette of a hunched woman stood out under the dim light of the street lamp. She was soaked, trembling, and with her hands pressed to her chest, she begged for something that only her cracked lips seemed to understand. "Sir, we can't allow this," Clarice the governess muttered with a frown. "These people always bring trouble." Arthur didn't answer immediately. His gaze remained fixed on the fragile figure. An uneasy current ran through him, something between compassion and distrust. He took a deep breath before turning to the woman. "How long have you been there?" he asked, his voice deep and controlled. "Oh, too much," Clarice replied. "You must go. I can give you some bread and send you back." Arthur shook his head. Without quite understanding why, he felt a pang in his chest. The rain, the helpless woman, all of it stirred something inside him that he preferred to forget. "Let her in," he said finally. "Excuse me?" Clarice looked at him, incredulous. "You heard right, Clarice. Come in and give him some dry clothes." The older woman's face hardened, but she obeyed. She opened the door with obvious disgust and let the stranger in. The young woman advanced unsteadily, leaving watermarks on the polished marble. Arthur looked at her more closely. Her torn jacket and hair stuck to her face revealed years of suffering in every crease. "Thank you," she stammered in a small voice. "I didn't know where to go." Arthur nodded silently, feeling strange in his own home. The mansion, with its tall columns and spacious rooms, seemed colder than ever. "What's your name?" he asked, trying not to sound too authoritarian in his tone. "Isabel," she answered, still looking at the ground. "Isabel, Clarice will bring you some dry clothes. I'll make you something hot to eat," she added, gesturing toward the kitchen. Translated from Spanish to English, www.onlinedoctranslator.com. Clarice clucked her tongue in disapproval, but set off for the stairs with a barely concealed snort. Isabel looked up for a moment. Her eyes, dark and tired, met Arthur's. He felt a strange connection, a distant echo of something he had long lost. "Thank you for helping me, sir," Isabel said softly. Arthur shook his head curtly. "Don't get used to it," he murmured, turning back to the window. The storm outside was still raging, but inside him, something was beginning to stir, something he didn't know if he should let out. Dinner passed in a heavy silence, interrupted only by the clink of cutlery against porcelain. The light from the chandelier hung weakly over the table, casting long, crooked shadows on the walls. Arthur watched Isabel with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion, taking care not to appear too obvious. Isabel ate slowly, as if she feared the food would disappear at any moment. She held the spoon in a trembling hand, her slender fingers contrasting with the clean plate in front of her. From the back of the room, Clarice watched her disapprovingly, her arms crossed and her expression stony, ready to intervene at the slightest mistake. Arthur tried to concentrate on his plate, but he couldn't help but feel that uncomfortable pang every time his gaze lingered on Isabel. Her movements, though fragile, had something familiar about them, like an echo from the past that insisted on resonating in his mind. However, it was when the young woman reached out for a glass that Arthur noticed something that chilled his blood. A brand. A small tattoo on the inside of his left wrist, almost erased by time and the elements. It was a simple, delicate, but unmistakable symbol, a small bird in flight. Arthur felt his heart stop for a second. That mark was identical to the one his daughter, Helena, had insisted on getting months before she disappeared. Arthur dropped his fork on the table with a thud, not realizing it. Isabel glanced at him, her expression bewildered, and quickly pulled down the sleeve of her worn blouse to hide her wrist. "Mr. Velasquez?" he asked, his voice uncertain. "Are you okay?" Arthur blinked several times and forced himself to react. Yes, I'm fine," he answered, although his voice sounded distant even for him. "Can I get you anything else, sir?" Clarice intervened, her tone colder than usual. I believe the guest has eaten enough. Arthur ignored the governess and instead turned his gaze to Isabel. The young woman kept her eyes fixed on her plate, avoiding any eye contact. She looked smaller than before, more vulnerable. "Isabel," he said, breaking the awkward silence. "Where are you from?" The young woman slowly raised her head, as if searching for the right words. "From many places, sir," he replied with a weak smile. "I haven't had a fixed home for years." Arthur nodded, as if he understood something beyond her words. "And your family?" he insisted, his voice softer, almost casual. "No, I don't remember her," Isabel murmured. The answer was like an invisible blow to Arthur. His mind was still fixed on that mark, on that little bird that reminded him so much of Helena. It was absurd, he thought, but a part of him couldn't ignore what he had seen. "You'd better get some rest, Miss Isabel," Clarice interrupted suddenly, moving toward the table. "That's enough for today." Isabel nodded meekly, pushing her chair back with a creak. Before leaving the dining room, she turned slightly and whispered, "Thank you, Mr. Velasquez, for your generosity." Arthur didn't answer. He sat there staring at the empty space where Isabel had been seconds before. That mark, that small detail, had completely disarmed him. As Clarice roughly cleared away the plates, Arthur remained lost in thought. The possibility, however remote, nestled in his chest like a seed that was impossible to ignore. The next morning, the mansion dawned shrouded in a dense silence, interrupted only by the distant echo of Clarice's footsteps. Isabel had woken early, sitting by a wide window that offered a view of the gardens soaked by the rain from the previous night. Arthur found her there, her gaze lost in the horizon, as if she were searching for something she couldn't reach. For a moment, she hesitated to approach him, but finally cleared her throat. "Did you rest well?" Isabel turned her head, startled. The morning light highlighted her tired face and her dark circles under her eyes. "Yes, thank you, Mr. Velasquez," he replied softly. Arthur nodded, watching her closely. There was something familiar about her, though he couldn't quite put his finger on what it was. Maybe it was her eyes, dark and deep, or the way she spoke, a mixture of caution and resignation. "Are you going to be here long?" he asked, searching for more details about her life. "I don't know," Isabel murmured. "I don't usually stay in any one place for long." Arthur crossed his arms and leaned against the windowsill. "Where are you from, Isabel?" The young woman hesitated, looking at her hands. She seemed to measure each word before she spoke, as if she were afraid of revealing too much. "I lived in orphanages since I was little," she finally confessed. "Then when I grew up, there was no place for me anymore. I learned to survive on my own." The sincerity of her answer took him by surprise. Arthur felt a pang in his chest. Those words stirred buried memories, images of Helena when she was still a child, of her small hands clinging to his as he told her he would never leave her alone. "And do you remember anything from before the orphanages?" he insisted, trying to maintain a neutral tone. Isabel shook her head. "Not much. Fragments. Images. A house maybe. A voice singing. But I don't know if it's real or if I made it up so I wouldn't feel so alone." Arthur felt a lump in his throat as he listened to her. This was too much like what he had feared all these years. Clarice suddenly burst into the room, her sharp gaze settling on both of them. "What are you doing here?" the governess asked coldly. "Sir, you should send her away before she causes us trouble." Arthur glared at her. "Isabel is my guest and she will stay as long as necessary," he responded sharply. Clarice pursed her lips, obviously annoyed, but didn't reply. She left the room, leaving behind an awkward silence. "You don't have to defend me, sir," Isabel murmured. "I'm used to it." Arthur shook his head. "You shouldn't be used to that, Isabel. No one should." Her words hung in the air. Arthur watched her once more before retreating, his thoughts growing cloudy. Isabel's voice and his fragmented memories were pieces of a puzzle he couldn't ignore. The day passed slowly, marked by the distant murmur of the wind and the rustling of the old clocks on the walls. Isabel walked through the mansion in silence, moving like a ghost through endless corridors. Her steps barely echoed on the thick carpets, and her fingers, fearful, brushed the surfaces of the dusty furniture. Curiosity led her to a room at the end of the hall, a half-open door that seemed forgotten. Inside, the smell of old wood and damp paper enveloped her. A dim light filtered through the curtains, illuminating a bookshelf filled with stacked books and boxes. On a worn oak table, Isabel found a dusty photo album. With trembling hands, she wiped it clean and opened it, feeling the weight of the thick pages beneath her fingers. Old images began to flash before her eyes. A smiling family, an elegant man standing next to a dark-haired girl whose eyes seemed eerily familiar. "What are you doing here?" Arthur's deep voice startled her. Isabel's head snapped up to see him standing in the doorway, his expression hard but gradually softening as he realized what she was holding. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to," Isabel began to say, clumsily closing the album. Arthur slowly moved forward, carefully taking the album from her hands. He held it for a moment, as if the object had a life of its own, and opened it again to a specific page. The photo showed a little girl with an innocent smile and a shiny bracelet on her wrist. "Who is she?" Isabel asked in a low voice. Arthur was slow to respond, his fingers caressing the edge of the picture. "My daughter," he said finally in a small voice. "Helena." Isabel felt a chill run down her spine. She looked at the photo closely, and a pang of recognition shot through her. "I've seen her before," he whispered without thinking. Arthur looked up suddenly, his eyes boring into hers intensely. "What did you say?" Isabel stumbled, searching for the right words. "I don't know where, but that bracelet," she pointed at the picture. "That bracelet was very shiny. I remember seeing it when I was a little girl, in a place with lots of other little girls." Arthur felt the air grow thick around him. His heart pounded in his chest, a mixture of hope and fear filling him. "Are you sure?" he insisted, taking a step towards her. Isabel hugged herself, feeling small under that intense gaze. "I don't know," he murmured. "They're just fragments, things I sometimes remember and don't understand if they're real or just dreams." Arthur closed the album slowly, trying to regain control of his emotions. That small mention, however vague, had stirred a hope he had been trying to bury for years. "This is important, Isabel," he said in a firm but calmer voice. "If you remember anything else, no matter how small, I want you to tell me." She nodded silently, not knowing what else to say. Arthur held the album to his chest and looked at her with a mixture of gravity and tenderness. "Come on, it's time for dinner." Arthur left the room first, leaving Isabel alone for a moment. She looked around one last time before following him, but in her mind, that image of the bracelet still shone like a beacon lost in the darkness. Night had fallen upon the mansion again, enveloping it in a heavy silence. Isabel sat in the main room near the lit fireplace. The light from the flames cast dancing shadows on the walls, the comforting warmth contrasting with the chill outside. Arthur sat opposite her, a cup of tea in his hands, watching her as if studying an unfinished painting. "Isabel," he finally said, breaking the silence. "Earlier in the room you mentioned a bracelet. What do you remember about it?" Isabel looked up slowly, her fingers playing with the edge of a blanket she had placed over her legs. She took a deep breath before speaking. "I'm not sure," she replied, her voice low. "It was a long time ago when I was still a child. At the orphanage where I grew up, I used to look for lost things to sell." Arthur frowned, leaning slightly towards her. "Lost things?" Isabel nodded, a small, sad smile appearing on her lips. "Yes. Sometimes I found broken toys, old clothes, things that nobody wanted. But one day, I saw something different. It was a silver bracelet with a small bird-shaped pendant. It looked new, as if someone had recently lost it." Arthur felt his heart begin to pound. The description matched perfectly. The bracelet Helena never took off, a special gift from her mother, had that same pendant, a small bird in flight. "What did you do with her?" Arthur asked, trying to remain calm. Isabel looked into the flames of the fireplace, as if searching for answers in them. "I kept it for a while. I liked looking at it because it was pretty, unlike anything I'd ever seen. But then, it disappeared. Someone must have taken it from me." Arthur set his cup down on the table with more force than necessary. He closed his eyes for a moment, fighting the whirlwind of emotions swirling inside him. That bracelet was a piece of the puzzle, tangible proof that Isabel was connected to Helena in some way. "Do you remember anything else?" he persisted, his voice barely a whisper. "Where were you? Who was taking care of you?" Isabel shook her head. "I don't know. Just blurry faces. An older woman, maybe. But it's all confusing. I don't know if it really happened or if I made it up so I wouldn't feel so alone." Arthur stood up and began to pace the room, his hands shaking slightly. Hope, that damned hope, was burning in his chest again, and with it, the fear of discovering a truth he couldn't bear. "Isabel," he said, turning to her, "I'm going to investigate this. I want to know what happened to you and how you found that bracelet." Isabel's eyes widened in surprise. "Because?" Arthur was silent for a moment before answering, his voice tinged with a vulnerability he rarely let on. "Because I think you could be the key to finding my daughter." Isabel stared at him, paralyzed. Those words hung in the air, heavy as a stone. The possibility was absurd, she thought, but something inside her told her that perhaps it wasn't so absurd. The flames in the fireplace crackled softly, filling the emptiness between them. Arthur sat back down, calmer now, but his gaze fixed on Isabel, determined not to stop until he discovered the truth. The next few days were filled with unusual movements in the mansion. Arthur, determined to find answers, had hired a private investigator. The usual silence of the house was replaced by phone calls and discreet visits that Clarice observed with growing concern. From a corner of the room, Isabel could sense the tension in the air. She felt like a stranger in that elegant house, trapped in the middle of a mystery that seemed to grow around her. Arthur, for his part, barely spoke to her, absorbed in the documents and notes he had accumulated in his office. One afternoon, while Isabel was helping Clarice clear the table, a gesture the housekeeper did not like, the woman broke her usual silence. "I don't know what you're up to," Clarice murmured dryly, "but you don't belong here." Isabel stopped and looked at Clarice calmly. "I don't want to cause any trouble," she replied softly. "I'll leave if that's what he wants." "It's not a question of wanting to," Clarice replied harshly. "Mr. Velasquez has suffered enough. You don't understand what it means to him to stir up the past." Isabel looked down, feeling the weight of the governess's words. Before she could respond, Arthur entered the room. He was carrying a folder in his hand and a tense expression on his face. "Isabel, come with me," he said firmly. She followed without question, leaving Clarice behind, watching with narrowed eyes. Arthur led her to his office, where an unknown man waited beside a pile of papers. "Isabel, this is Mr. Olivares," said Arthur, pointing at the man. "He is a researcher and has discovered something important." Mr. Olivares, a middle-aged man with thick glasses and a kind face, nodded with a slight smile. "Miss, I've been doing some research on the orphanage where you grew up. I found old records and spoke to people who knew the director of that place." Isabel felt a knot in her stomach. Her hands gripped the edge of her chair as she listened. There was a woman, the one who ran the orphanage at the time. She died a few years ago, but she left behind documents that mention a very special little girl who arrived there unexpectedly. A little girl with a silver bracelet. Arthur clenched his fists at that, his eyes fixed on Isabel, searching for any sign of truth in her expression. "What does that mean?" Isabel asked, her voice barely audible. Olivares took a worn photograph and handed it to her. The image showed an old woman with a group of little girls. Among them, one stood out because of the shine of an object on her wrist. Isabel felt a jolt of recognition. "That's me," she whispered, her eyes wide. Arthur closed his eyes for a moment, holding back the emotions that threatened to spill over. The connection was becoming clearer, and though the answers were still incomplete, the truth seemed closer than ever. The rain returned that night, as if the sky also felt the tension that was flooding the mansion. Arthur remained seated in his office, with his elbows resting on the desk and his hands clasped in front of his mouth. In front of him, the folder with the documents brought by Olivares rested open, each paper more revealing than the last. Isabel sat across the room, watching in silence. Ever since she saw that photograph, a whirlwind of fragmented memories had tormented her. The bracelet, the old woman, the orphanage. Everything was beginning to fit together, but the pieces still didn't form a clear whole. Mr. Olivares, Arthur murmured suddenly, his voice hoarse. Are you sure there are no more records about that woman? The researcher, who had until now been standing by the window, shook his head. No, Mr. Velasquez. The director of the orphanage died years ago, and most of the records were lost. Only these documents and some notes that mention a little girl who arrived with a very peculiar bracelet remained. Arthur leaned forward, resting one hand on the open folder. What about the other children? Does anyone remember any more details about her? Olivares sighed with a look of regret. Some said the girl was very scared when she arrived. She never spoke about her family. After a short time, she disappeared from the orphanage, and no one heard from her again. A heavy silence settled over the room. Arthur looked at Isabel, his eyes searching hers for answers. Do you remember anything else? He asked, his voice soft, almost pleading. Anything about how you got there, or who took you? Isabel closed her eyes for a moment, trying to hold on to the fragments of memory that floated through her mind. The image of a blurry figure appeared, a warm hand holding hers and a voice murmuring reassuring words. A woman left me there, he finally said, his voice shaking. I think she was older. I don't remember her face, but I do remember her voice. She told me I would be safe. Arthur took a deep breath, feeling his heart racing. Every word Isabel said was like a thread bringing him closer to the truth. The possibility that she was Helena grew with every minute, and although the fear of being wrong tormented him, hope kept him strong. Isabel, Arthur said after a moment, I don't know if you understand how important this is to me. Isabel looked at him cautiously, her dark eyes reflecting a mix of uncertainty and fear. Do you think I'm your daughter? She asked finally, breaking the silence. Arthur held her gaze, a deep sadness in his eyes. I don't know, but I can't ignore what I feel, he answered honestly. Every piece, every memory you have seems to lead me to Helena. Isabel looked away, hugging herself. The idea was absurd and terrifying, but a part of her wanted to believe it could be true. Suddenly, a noise at the door startled them. Clarice was there, her face hardened and her expression disdainful. Excuse me, sir, but this situation is untenable, he said in a firm voice. You are allowing this stranger to play with your feelings. Arthur stood up, his gaze cold and determined. Clarice, it's none of your business. From now on, don't interfere. Clarice pressed her lips together, stepping back with a resentful look before disappearing down the hall. Arthur sat back down, looking steadily at Isabel. We are going to discover the truth, Isabel, he said decisively. Whatever it is. Isabel nodded silently. For the first time in years, she felt the shadows of her past begin to dissipate. The morning dawned gray, as if the sky had a premonition of the storm that was about to break out inside the mansion. Isabel remained in the living room, sitting on the edge of the sofa, her nervous fingers interlaced. From Arthur's office, barely audible murmurs came. He was looking through the investigator's documents again, looking for something that still didn't fit. Suddenly, Clarice entered the room with a tray of tea in her hands and an expression of apparent calm that hid her true intention. You should get ready to leave, Clarice said suddenly, her voice as cold as the wind blowing outside. Isabel raised her head, puzzled. Why do you say that? Clarice placed the tray carefully and stared at it. Because this can't last. Mr. Arthur is a vulnerable man, and you're taking advantage of that. Or do you think he'll believe that absurd story about his missing daughter? The words landed like a blow. Isabel felt the heat rise to her face. I didn't come here to deceive anyone, he replied firmly. He was the one who wanted to find out the truth. The truth? Clarice let out a bitter laugh. The only truth is that he is desperate, and you are an opportunist who saw a way to get into this house. Isabel stood up, her hands shaking. You don't know anything about me or what I've been through. I know enough, the governess replied, taking a few steps closer. I have served this family for years. You are not welcome here, young lady. Before Isabel could respond, Arthur appeared in the doorway. His face was a mixture of anger and confusion. What's going on here? Clarice took a step back, her expression transforming into a mask of false innocence. Sir, I was trying to talk some sense into her. You can't trust someone like her. You're letting her play with your emotions. Enough, Clarice! Arthur roared, with a harshness that echoed off the walls. "I will not tolerate your comments any longer." Clarice opened her mouth to retort, but Arthur's gaze stopped her short. Without another word, she turned on her heel and walked out of the room, closing the door with a thud. Arthur turned to Isabel, who was still standing, breathing heavily. "I'm sorry," he said softly. "I shouldn't have said that to you." Isabel shook her head, fighting back tears. "Maybe he's right," she whispered. "I shouldn't be here." Arthur stepped closer, his expression softer now. "No, Isabel. All this, everything we've discovered, it can't be a coincidence. I saw how you reacted to that photograph. I heard what you remember. I need to believe there's something more." Isabel looked into his eyes and for the first time, allowed a tear to slide down her cheek. "I want to believe it too, but I'm scared," Arthur sighed and nodded. "I have it too," he confessed, "but we can't ignore what we know." They both fell silent, as if the words had drained all the energy in the room. From outside, the wind was pounding against the windows, as if the entire world was at war with what was happening within those walls. For the first time, Isabel allowed hope to creep into her thoughts. Maybe, just maybe, the echo of her past was about to reveal to her the truth she had sought for so long. Arthur sat in his office, his hands shaking on his desk. The weight of the documents and the doubts accumulated over the years weighed him down. Isabel stood nervously by the half-open door. "Isabel, come here," Arthur asked with a tired but firm voice. She walked slowly forward and sat down opposite him, feeling small in the huge room. Arthur's eyes, full of unanswered questions, stared at her. "I need you to tell me the truth," he began, his tone grave. "Everything you remember, everything you've lived through." Isabel took a deep breath and closed her eyes, searching through her fragmented memory. "I don't know how it all started," she whispered. "But I remember the orphanage. I remember always feeling different from the other children, like I didn't belong there. The woman who looked after me used to say that someone had left me with a bracelet on my wrist." Arthur nodded slowly, his fingers drumming on the desk. "The bracelet?" "Yes," Isabel continued, her voice shaking. "It was silver, with a little bird on it. I didn't understand its value. It was just something pretty to me." Arthur felt a lump in his throat. That bracelet, that symbol, was the key piece that had kept him alive all those years of uncertainty. "Isabel," he said, swallowing, "my daughter, Helena, she had an identical bracelet, a gift from her mother before she died." The words fell on Isabel like a blow. She felt the full weight of her past crushing her. "Do you think I'm her?" she asked, not daring to look at Arthur. Arthur stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the dark garden. "I want to believe it," he replied in a broken voice, "but I don't want to fool myself, not after so many years." The silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. Finally, Isabel burst into tears, covering her face with her hands. "I don't remember my parents," she sobbed. "I don't remember anything but fragments. I can't be who you're looking for, but I don't know who I am either." Arthur turned to her, his heart torn between hope and doubt. He approached slowly and placed a firm hand on her shoulder. "Isabel, it doesn't matter if you are my daughter or not. What matters is that we will find the truth together." Isabel looked up, her misty eyes meeting his. For the first time, she felt like she wasn't alone. Arthur also understood that, even though the truth might hurt him, he wouldn't let Isabel carry the weight of uncertainty. At that moment, the office door flew open. Clarice burst in, her face disfigured. "You can't trust her," he shouted. "She's playing with you." Arthur straightened up with unexpected calm. "Clarice, your time here is up." The woman looked at him in disbelief before storming off. Arthur turned back to Isabel, his expression calm. "It's time to leave the past behind and face whatever comes next. Together." Isabel nodded weakly, feeling that, for the first time, the echo of the past was beginning to lose its strength. Dawn filtered its golden light through the mansion's windows, illuminating the dark hallways and bringing an air of renewal. Isabel was in the garden, sitting under a leafy tree, her gaze lost in the horizon. At her side, Arthur remained silent, watching how the rising sun cleared the shadows that had dominated their lives for so long. "I've spent years wondering what I did wrong," Arthur murmured, breaking the silence, "thinking about how I could have lost Helena." Isabel glanced at him from the corner of her eye. His face was serene, although his eyes betrayed the weight of time and the pain he still carried. "It wasn't his fault," she said softly. "Sometimes life takes things away from us that we don't understand." Arthur nodded, though the words did little to soothe the wound that still burned in his chest. "But you're here now," he continued, turning to Isabel. "And it doesn't matter what we discover. To me, you're already part of my life." Isabel was silent for a moment, taking those words in. It was the first time in a long time that someone had made her feel valuable, like she really belonged somewhere. "Thank you," she murmured with a shy smile. "I don't know what all this means, but I want to stay, if you'll let me." Arthur smiled weakly and placed a firm hand on her shoulder. "This house is as much yours as it is mine, Isabel. We may not be able to change the past, but we can choose what to do with the present." Suddenly, the sound of the front door interrupted the moment. A pair of young men entered with boxes and materials. Arthur stood up, watching them work under his orders. "What's going on?" Isabel asked, curious. "It's time to give this house a purpose," Arthur replied, a gleam in his eyes that hadn't been there in years. "I've made a decision." He led her into the main room, where tables and materials were already set up. On a blank wall, Arthur displayed a sign that read, "Home of Hope, Reception Center." Arthur nodded slowly, his fingers drumming on the desk. "The bracelet?" "Yes," Isabel continued, her voice shaking. "It was silver, with a little bird on it. I didn't understand its value. It was just something pretty to me." Arthur felt a lump in his throat. That bracelet, that symbol, was the key piece that had kept him alive all those years of uncertainty. "Isabel," he said, swallowing, "my daughter, Helena, she had an identical bracelet, a gift from her mother before she died." The words fell on Isabel like a blow. She felt the full weight of her past crushing her. "Do you think I'm her?" she asked, not daring to look at Arthur. Arthur stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the dark garden. "I want to believe it," he replied in a broken voice, "but I don't want to fool myself, not after so many years." The silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. Finally, Isabel burst into tears, covering her face with her hands. "I don't remember my parents," she sobbed. "I don't remember anything but fragments. I can't be who you're looking for. But I don't know who I am either." Arthur turned to her, his heart torn between hope and doubt. He approached slowly and placed a firm hand on her shoulder. "Isabel, it doesn't matter if you are my daughter or not. What matters is that we will find the truth together." Isabel looked up, her misty eyes meeting his. For the first time, she felt like she wasn't alone. Arthur also understood that, even though the truth might hurt him, he wouldn't let Isabel carry the weight of uncertainty. At that moment, the office door flew open. Clarice burst in, her face disfigured. "You can't trust her," he shouted. "She's playing with you." Arthur straightened up with unexpected calm. "Clarice, your time here is up." The woman looked at him in disbelief before storming off. Arthur turned back to Isabel, his expression calm. "It's time to leave the past behind and face whatever comes next. Together." Isabel nodded weakly, feeling that, for the first time, the echo of the past was beginning to lose its strength. Dawn filtered its golden light through the mansion's windows, illuminating the dark hallways and bringing an air of renewal. Isabel was in the garden, sitting under a leafy tree, her gaze lost in the horizon. At her side, Arthur remained silent, watching how the rising sun cleared the shadows that had dominated their lives. Isabel covered her mouth with her hands, surprised. "Are you going to turn the mansion into a shelter?" Arthur nodded. "Here, where so many things were broken, we will build something new. We will help those who have nothing, as you once did." Isabel felt a lump in her throat. The idea moved her to the core. "This is incredible," she murmured, still in awe. Arthur looked at her fondly. "This is the first step, Isabel. The beginning of something better, not just for us, but for many people." Over the next few days, the mansion began to transform. Closed rooms opened, dust replaced with light and life. Isabel worked side by side with Arthur, feeling that each painted wall and restored space also healed a piece of her own heart. One Sunday afternoon, while new curtains were being hung in the drawing room, Arthur stopped and watched Isabel. "Helena or not, the only thing that matters is that you are here," he said tenderly, "and you will always have a place in my life." Isabel smiled, feeling Arthur's words take root within her. At last, after years of wandering aimlessly, she had found a home. The wind blew gently through the open windows, carrying with it the echoes of the past and leaving in its place the promise of a new future, full of hope and second chances. Sometimes life confronts us with unexpected tests that awaken old wounds and force us to look the past in the eye. Arthur, by opening the doors of his mansion to a stranger, not only found answers about his lost daughter, but also a second chance to heal and give purpose to his life. Would you have done the same in his place? Would you dare to face the ghosts of the past in search of the truth? Click on the video on the screen to continue this exciting journey of self-discovery and second chances. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss out on more inspiring stories that can transform your outlook on life. See you in the next video.